On to Module 5, and in this module we consider the role of victims in the restorative justice process and the research that has been done about the impact that these processes have on victims. Last week we looked at offenders and we looked at the research there, so this week we're turning around and looking at victims and community perspectives. Alright, one thing that's important to consider here is the general rate of victim and let's even just witness dissatisfaction with the conventional justice system. So these evaluations of the restorative justice innovations are not existing in a vacuum, and generally speaking both victims and witnesses have a pretty poor experience of the criminal justice system. And when we look at even not so much the big issues, but the little everyday issues. I mean, if you're a witness, victim or otherwise, it's your own expense and your own costs, really, to appear in court. And yes, there are some subsidies that are paid for travel and so on, but you generally have to take time off of work for which you're not compensated. And the time that you spend waiting for the time to appear in court can be very, very variable, and prosecutors try as best they might to try and predict how a case will go, to try and limit the amount of time people have to spend waiting around outside a courtroom, possibly with the offender's family, to give evidence in a trial. But it's not always possible. Quite often there are wrinkles in the case, things that need to be solved, and witnesses end up spending a few days more than predicted waiting for their time to appear in court. They get into court, they get if they're not repeat players, so there's a clear discrepancy between the experience of repeat players like police, expert witnesses and so on, and the one-off people who have a much, much worse time, obviously, and an experience that's intimidating, that they're not familiar with the process and so on. They give their evidence and then it's out, goodbye, no notification. Sometimes if there's a prosecutor or a police officer who is more hands-on, usually the police officer who's supervising the case is more hands-on, they will have a follow-up with the victims/witnesses, but not always. Sometimes it's just like you're kicked out of court and it's like, oh well, that's it for the rest of your life. And recently we've had things like victim impact statements and things that we've brought victims back to be more involved in the process. But in the bad old days, it was just like, well, off you go, on with your life. You've got emotional problems now, well, you better find a way to solve those. And in jurisdictions like the United States, where you don't have free medical care, you can end up with health issues, with psychological issues that you just never get any help with as a result of the situation. So yes, victims, along with other witnesses, have traditionally had a very poor time with the criminal justice system. Not only that, cross-examination is quite rigorous. They can be called a liar, they can be really forced to go through the details of an experience again and again, and there are a lot of procedures there to really test, or they're designed, I don't know if they are effective, but they're designed to test the integrity of a witness. And many witnesses, particularly victims, experience that as quite unfair. Why is it that the offender is not required to give evidence? And in fact, most lawyers will tell offenders, do not give evidence in your own trial, because that makes you that lets you become exposed to cross-examination, where the other side can ask you those kind of searching, probing questions, quite aggressive questions. Well, there's no option when you're a witness or a victim. The fact that you're giving evidence means the defense will come along and say, you're lying about this, aren't you? You're mistaken about this. How come you said this and then you said that? How come there are all these discrepancies in your story? And I think this is one of the real insoluble issues of the criminal justice system, and I think this is why we're looking for alternatives now, is because there aren't really that many options to be nicer to witnesses and victims. And this is not because we have a suspicion about victims and witnesses, although sometimes we do, but it's largely because we have quite well-founded suspicions about the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system has a long history of framing people, trumped up charges, of coercing witnesses, of coercing victims to giving false testimony, and the consequences of conviction are quite significant. So the system has this sort of ability to be quite aggressive towards victims and witnesses, not because we necessarily don't believe them, although there's a strong history in things like sexual assault of just not believing the victims because of cultural biases, but we've got a really well-founded, evidenced suspicion of the way in which the state can use criminal justice processes against minorities and against political opponents and radicals and dissidents and so on. So yeah, I mean, as much as we'd like to hashtag believe all women, and I find that movement to be admirable politically, we can't just be nice. The way the system exists, we can't just be nice to all the victims and treat them and witnesses and treat them with kid gloves, because we don't trust the state. The state has a long history of using criminal justice processes in a way that are completely unfair and are untrue. And often the witnesses / victims get caught as the meat in the sandwich. They get threatened and bullied into giving testimony. And then they get cross-examined by the defence, and when I say there's like this misuse of the system by the state, I mean it can be the high-end, political conspiracy to get rid of a political opponent. We see that a lot in many parts of the world, less directly in countries that have a healthy media. But it can be really low-key as well. It can be a stubborn police officer who makes a mistake and is unwilling, unable to reassess the position and pushes through a prosecution on something that they've just made a mistake about, but they're unwilling to take an objective view of the facts. So it's not always the case that the state conspires or is deliberate to be oppressive to victims. It's just the fact that the system is flawed, and in many cases the biases of wider society, the needs to push through heaps of cases through the factory, the justice factory that is the courts, means that people are just treated unfairly. Of course, the solution to that is to fix the system and to make the system fair, and that's a long-term project, and that's something that's not, going to necessarily happen very quickly. Hence the need for innovations like, these restorative justice programs that we've talked about. So let's get back to those victims. We know that victims are generally pretty unsatisfied with the way they get treated by the criminal justice system. What about victims who've been through these alternative processes? Well, the RISE project, which we mentioned previously, showed that more victims were satisfied by the way the case was handled than those who went through the court processes. Remember, that was one where there was a comparison of victims in conventional justice, restorative justice. They found that more victims were generally the restorative justice victims had a much better experience, and the IJRJE project, 90% of the victims strongly agreed that they were satisfied with the proceedings. So as far as victims' satisfaction with proceedings go, we've got reasonably strong levels of satisfaction. In terms of emotional restoration, we've got an ongoing question, and the readings this week talk about this in a lot more depth than I'm going to talk about now, is, well, what is restoration? when we're looking at civil law, and remember, a lot of things like an assault is both a civil crime and a civil wrong and a criminal wrong. So if you get assaulted, you can go through the either or both, the criminal justice process of reporting to police, or you can litigate against a person if they have the resources. And quite often, when we talk about material restoration, people who are offenders traditionally don't have the access to resources to necessarily, pay people back for the wrong that they've done in monetary terms. However, we also look at the impact on victims in terms of emotional restoration, and this is one of the most significant areas of restoration for victims in terms of reduction of levels of fear, and reductions of fear of being re-victimized, or just fear, social fear generally. They find that, generally speaking, victims have significantly less likelihood to fear re-victimisation and other forms of fear if they go through the restorative justice process. And that's really, that's explained by the fact that they actually get to see the offender as a whole person, understand them in more detail, whereas in the traditional process, they're just the person sitting in the dock, and they might look, and the person that they've only encountered, which they've had with them, has been through being a victim, and they don't get to know them at all, and they can look very scary, and the whole process can actually emphasize and exacerbate that fear of crime. If you're giving evidence as a witness in the dock, and the accused sitting there scowling at you because they're obviously not enjoying the process, it can be very intimidating. But these restorative justice processes that require the offenders to open up and to be more, more vulnerable, and to actually present themselves as a person, and to, make an apology, can be significantly, can lead to significantly better well-being for victims. And this is especially true with things like burglary, where you never ever see the offender, and there's been many cases where victims will assume the worst. They'll assume these terrible, scary, horrible thugs have been into their house and whatever, and when they see that often burglaries are done by a bunch of kids, I don't mean that as in minors. I mean just in terms of just young, inexperienced people who don't have very good impulse control. It can actually be a great relief for victims to be able to look at it and go, all this time I imagined that Hannibal Lecter was creeping around in my underwear drawer and doing all kinds of terrible things. Now I see they're just a bunch of stupid kids. I feel a whole lot better about the experience. And I didn't enjoy the experience, obviously, but I don't have that same fear. There's been experience, research into PTSD, and there's a Aniel et al. Or Angel et al. Work that's cited in the materials says there's significantly lower levels of PTSD that come as a result of these restorative justice processes. And as I said a little earlier on, victims don't get help or treatment for any of these things as an ordinary part of their recovery. Later on, we're going to look at therapeutic jurisprudence, which imputes a whole lot of medical models and medical ways of thinking to the process. That's towards the end of term. And in that approach, you really do start with what the victim needs. And in some ways, that's even more victim focused, because different victims are going to respond differently to exactly the same situation. A victim can suffer a minor assault, which for one person it might be something they shrug off as experience. They didn't like it, but it was just a bad experience. And another person can be emotionally devastated by that assault. Therapeutic jurisprudence starts with the position of, regardless of what we do with the offender, let's start with what the victims actually need. Anyway, we've got research evidence that the restorative justice processes are already more aligned to that way of thinking. Now, in terms of understanding the consequences of a restorative process for the victims, the biggest study we have here is the South Australian Juvenile Justice Project, the SAJJ, which I talked about last week, and the work of Kathleen Daly in response to that. And this is, I think, one of the major there can often be a bit of a missionary zeal around restorative justice, where people get, converted to the idea and they think it's great and they become very activist about it, and they're not necessarily as critical as they should be. And Kathleen Daly is someone who pulls the brakes on it and says, look, hang on, we've got to be really careful with our results, and we don't want to she is in favour of the process, but she doesn't want to overpromise or over-report, because she knows how lethal that can be for innovation if we later get evidence that shows that we were over enthusiastic. A government a later study that shows that you were overly enthusiastic can lead to a government just cancelling a project. So you need to be very careful and scrupulous about your data. So the SAJJ project asked 3 questions. What are the dimensions of restorativeness? Like, what is restoration? 2, are the judgments about restoration different from the victim and offender, or do they come together and do they agree? And 3, is the success of these meetings relevant to future behaviour and well-being of victim and offenders? Do we have any evidence that down the track offenders are, not reoffending or are desisting? Remember last week's discussion, or that offenders are feeling better. So there was some pretty rigorous questions asked there. And they were asked 1 month after the interviews, 1 month after the restorative justice meetings, and then 1 year after. So there was a longitudinal aspect to it. Because these processes are reasonably new, we don't have like the 10-year, the 20-year studies really to go on. But there is going to be differences really between a month after the process, particularly if it's been really successful, and then what you feel more realistically 12 months later. All right, so in terms of mutual understanding and, did the victim and offender come together and understand each other better, they found that it was only present in about 60% of the cases. Now, that's obviously a lot more than conventional justice, but it was still much lower than people hoped that it would be. They also found that in terms of victims' understanding of offenders, that was only really present in about 30% of the cases. And again, that was much, much lower than we hoped. The advocates of this process had thought that victims would come away saying, look, now I understand the offender and I feel better, blah, 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 blah. They found it happened in about 30% of the cases. Now, I still think that that's going to be massively higher than our conventional processes, so we shouldn't write it off. However, we did hope that it would be much higher. Part of that was the perceptions around whether the apology was sincere. About 60% of offenders said that they were sorry, but only 30% of the victims felt that it was sincere. So there was a real gap between offenders believing they were being sincere, or at least telling the surveys that they were being sincere, and the victim's belief in that sincerity. In terms of impact of the distress on victims ongoing, they found some very interesting stats out of this project, in that there was really 2 groups of victims, high distressed and low distress. And this was not necessarily even all that dependent on the facts of the crime, but that some victims became very, very distressed by their experience. Some were less distressed. Generally speaking, the low distress victims reported much more satisfaction with the process. It's probably kind of obvious that they bounced back a lot more easily. The high distress victims reported much higher levels of health problems, security concerns, self-confidence, and so on. So again, flagging ahead what we're going to talk about in therapeutic jurisprudence, there is a sense in which that sometimes even irrespective of what the offender does, victims have these different responses, and that's going to really flavour their experience of any kind of process, whether it's a reintegrative one or not. All right, the last thing I want to mention in this lecture is the question of community involvement, because we already talk about the victim and community. Why do we talk about community? Well, quite often, for a lot of juvenile offences, things like vandalism, public disorder, whatever, there's no clear victim. And we know that restoration is more effective for young offenders, and the gateway into crime for young offenders is quite often what we would, generally call victimless offences. And remember, restorative justice is also used in drug courts as well. But even just, we're talking about youthful criminality and delinquency. We're looking at vandalism, public affray, public drunkenness, public, acting out in a way there's not a specific person who we bring in and say, you're the victim of this. Sometimes there are. I'm not saying there are no victims there. Your property, your business has its window smashed in. Obviously, you're a victim of that. But often there is a much more diffuse sense of victimization, which is often where we bring in communities and community panels. Why is community important? Research by Rosner and Bruce says that there are 4 justifications. First, that it's very symbolic, and it's historically important to bring community back into the processes. Remember the stuff about conflicts as property, that the state has stolen conflicts from the community. So it's important to really symbolically bring the community back in. Second, it may promote the ritual aspects. Having the community involved promotes the ritual aspects of restoration. And again, remembering back previous modules, the interaction ritual theory is part of that. Third, it can add legitimacy to the proceedings, where it's no longer seen as this is just authority against the youths. It can actually seem to be more legitimate because it's actually looking at the impact on the community. And finally, community involvement can increase the ability to provide reintegration by having more people in what we call the community of care, people who are out there who are going to support the offender in their reintegration into society. And those are people who just really aren't part of the traditional system. We don't have the family members, the footy coach, the local youth workers, the people who are actually going to help the offender become reintegrated into society. This is an area where there's been very little research, and it's something that's that's beginning to be researched now. There are some concerns that if we have community panels, then we're just going to end up with effectively pseudo judges if it's the same people coming in and processing things again and again. But there's really not much evidence either way to support or argue against community involvement. So this is a, watch this space. This is something where there needs to be research done. There'll be really interesting research come out of it. There has been some research in terms of public support of restorative justice, and you might be surprised that the public is broadly supportive. In terms of as at least as a hypothetical or theoretical concept, the community is very much in support of restorative justice. Now, when we're talking about specific offenders, when we've got politicians and the media commenting on them and telling us what monsters they are, public opinion changes quite significantly, which is why we can't look at any of this in abstract, and we really have to look at the context in which these things occur. So we see there's a very, very strong role of the media in amplifying fear of crime, in demonizing offenders, in steering the community away from the basic values that the community seems to have, which is, we don't want retribution. We want a process that's going to fix people, that's going to help victims, that's going to be positive going forward. But if we get on Facebook, within 5 minutes of being on Facebook, we're back to saying, hang them, torture them, whatever. Prison's too good for them, how come I don't have a toasted cheese maker, toasted cheese sandwich maker? That's a controversy from a few years ago, where the media got very put out that some prisoners had toasted cheese sandwich makers. Anyway, so I think, but I think that's generally positive. I think generally we've got a positive set of experiences from victims, and we've got a positive sense of these projects and these programs from the community generally.